Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
I was done. This time I meant it. I found myself considering it several times in my life, contemplating taking my trip to the other side. The last time I called the suicide hotline, I eventually decided to give life one more try. Not this time. I felt completely at peace about it. This time I was truly ready. I slipped the rope over my neck. The rope was tied to a metal loop drilled into the framing to ensure that I would not fail. I lifted my foot, ready to step off the chair. Then, someone knocked on the door. Who the hell could be knocking on the door? I spent every last dollar I had to rent this remote cabin where I could spend my last weekend in beauty and peace. The nearest house was half a mile away. Curiosity got the better of me. It's not like the rope was going anywhere. Peering through the window, I could see a man wearing a black hoodie with the hood up. He knocked again, louder.
God damn it,
I said out loud. I wanted this to be peaceful, and this asshole was ruining the vibe, screwing up my plan. I walked out of the single bedroom onto the loft and down the stairs to the living room, kitchen, and front door. Since he didn't seem to be leaving on his own, I opened the door. "What do you want?" I said rudely.
"Good evening, sir,"
the stranger said, a little too nicely.
"My car broke down about a mile down that dirt road, and I was wondering if I could use your phone."
The man sounded like a used car salesman, fake and rehearsed. "I don't have a phone," I told him coldly. It was a lie, of course.
"Oh, I'm sure you have a phone. All the cabins up here do." "Not this one."
I started shutting the door when he stuck his foot in the doorway, preventing me from closing the door all of the way.
"It'll only take me 30 seconds, then I'll be gone."
Without even giving him a response, I pushed him away from the door and slammed it shut. For good measure, I locked the deadbolt as well. I should have been more disturbed, but I was just grumpy about the dude's timing, ruining my peaceful death. Why should I help the guy anyway? Nobody ever lent me a helping hand. That's just how this cruel world works. Nobody gives a shit. And who puts their foot in someone's door? I walked back upstairs and peered out through the window to watch him leave. He was gone, but I hadn't seen him leave. The dirt road leading up to the cabin was long and straight. I should still see him. I should see him still walking away. I needed to make sure this guy was gone to find my peace with death again. I checked all the windows looking for the weirdo. Nothing. He must have run or something, and made it out of sight quickly. I pushed the asshole out of my mind. It was time to find my peace again. I realized that the sun was now starting to set over the nearby mountain peaks. Why not watch it? This would be my last sunset. And it sure was a beautiful one. I pulled the cozy recliner chair to the large upstairs window. Brilliant colors of orange and pink now filled the sky. The clouds were broken up, creating the appearance of a sizable, beautiful pathway over the horizon. There it was, My beautiful pathway to the afterlife had presented itself. It was time to take the path. Standing back on the chair, I once again placed the rope over my neck. I positioned myself so I was facing the sunset. At that moment, I was utterly at peace with my death. Loud, panicked knocking at the door startled me so much that I almost fell off the chair. "What the hell?" This time I yelled it out loud. Once again, my beautiful, peaceful moment was ruined. I removed the rope, walking to the opposite window to see who the hell had screwed everything up. This time, it was not the hooded weirdo standing at the door. It was a girl. She was crying and panicked, knocking repeatedly. As I approached the door, I could hear her now pleading for help, still pounding on the door. The second I opened the door, she pushed herself in, slamming the door behind her and locking it. "What the hell?" I started asking, but before I could finish my question, she reached out and pulled me into a tight hug. Never in my life had I felt anybody embrace me as tightly as this crying girl was embracing me right now. My entire demeanor immediately changed, and I hugged her back. "What's going on? What's wrong?" I asked her with genuine concern. She pulled back and looked me in the eye. I couldn't help but notice that, even through her tears, she was gorgeous. Her long dark hair complemented those beautiful green eyes. They were a shade of green that I had never before seen. For a moment, I lost myself in her eyes. I came back to reality when she started talking.
"He killed her! He killed Jess!"
She sobbed.
"His man, he came to the door and asked to use the phone, so I let him in. Then he pulled a knife and killed her."
The girl burst into uncontrollable sobs and buried her face in my shoulder, and I squeezed her tightly. It hit me at that moment. She had just described the man that had knocked on the door earlier. Holy shit, that man had killed somebody. Snapping into task mode, I led the girl into the kitchen, where I called 911.
911, what's your emergency?
"My name is Dean Johansson. There's been a murder. Please come quick." I gave her the address of the cabin I was staying at. Thankfully, it was on a card by the landline phone. I asked the girl for the address where the murder happened. She didn't know, but she managed to tell the operator that her name was Sarah, and that someone had just murdered Jess.
Okay, sir, please lock the doors and stay inside. Emergency responders will be there in about 30 minutes.
30 minutes? What do you mean 30 minutes? There's a murderer on the loose.
I'm sorry, sir, that's the closest law enforcement to you. You're in a remote area.
Before I could respond, there was a loud knock on the door. Sarah cried, and I dropped the phone. Quietly, I walked to the door and nervously looked through the peephole. It was him, the hooded car salesman asshole. He was covered in blood now and holding a dripping knife. "I need to borrow your phone!" His nice fake candor had been replaced with a manic and loud tone. Boom! He kicked the door. I ran to the kitchen to grab my knife. Sarah was already holding one. Boom! There was another kick. We stood there, terrified and not knowing what to do. I braced for another crash, but there wasn't one. It was silent. "Why don't you go upstairs?" I told Sarah. "I'll stay down here just in case." I came to this cabin prepared to meet death. Sarah didn't deserve that, though. I had only just met her, but I felt a genuine desire to protect her. Sarah nodded and headed up the stairs. Just as she crossed the final step, the sliding glass back door window exploded as a rock blasted through. The man came climbing in through the large window. The expression on his face was one of adrenalized mania. I grabbed an ugly vase off the nearby end table and threw it at him with all my might. It missed terribly. Knife still in my hand, I picked up a wooden chair and charged at him with bravery I had never felt before. The collision knocked both of us to the ground. I slashed him with my knife, aiming for the neck, and I missed again, but still sliced through his face. He slashed right back at me, putting a deep cut into my upper chest. I rolled backward, trying to get up to my feet. Before I was up, the chair hit me on my face and knocked me back to the ground. I stammered back up to my feet with another slash, narrowly missing me. I started punching and slashing wildly now. I admit that I don't know how to fight. I've never needed to before. I connected at least once more with the knife. Then, naturally, I tripped. The man slammed that vase I threw at him onto my head, shattering it into pieces. He stomped on my face, and I blacked out. A couple of seconds later, I came to find the man almost at the top of the stairs. Sarah was screaming. Her scream sparked my adrenaline, and I found myself running up the stairs. I tackled him from behind and slammed my knife into his back. I was trying to hold him down, but he was stronger than me. As he was getting back up, I saw Sarah running through the door with my rope. On cue, I grabbed around his arm, squeezing as tight as I possibly could as Sarah put the noose over his head. He was fighting violently now. I knew that I would be unable to restrain him for long, even with that knife sticking in his back. Sarah was quickly tying the other end of the rope to the railing with shaky hands. With a sudden burst of strength, the killer broke his arms free and lunged at Sarah. I charged with all of my might, pushing him toward the railing. Sarah jumped into the fight as well. Together, we gave a final push, knocking the killer over the railing and off the loft. The rope caught. With an audible crack, his fall was broken, as was his neck. Both of our knots had held. Silence fell as the body of the man who tried to murder us swung over the living room, suspended by a noose. My noose. Sarah and I sat outside, waiting for the police to arrive. She was holding the bathroom towel over the deep cut in my chest. I was awkwardly avoiding the inevitable truth that she had seen the noose I had intended to use to take my own life. I knew she had put two and two together. She broke the awkward silence.
Were you gonna kill yourself tonight?
She asked bluntly, but with a kindness that could not be mistaken. Yes, I admitted.
Please don't.
Sarah told me, looking into my eyes. Her teary eyes were all so beautiful, and it was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. I won't, I promised, with tears now finding their way down my face. And I meant it. That was just over 18 months ago now. And I'm happy to tell you that I'm still here. I no longer want to die. But this story isn't just the story of how I didn't kill myself, but also the story of how I met my wife, Sarah. We are celebrating our honeymoon now at a beautiful beach house overlooking the ocean. We chose a location as far from the woods as possible. We are still healing, but we are healing together. Sarah is recovering from the trauma of her best friend, Jessica, being murdered. I am healing from years of personal neglect and self-destructive behavior. I didn't realize how broken I truly was until I met Sarah. As I sit here now under the most beautiful sunset I have seen since that fateful day, I finally realized what was missing in my life. What was missing was the feeling of being loved. And more importantly, having somebody to love.
The fire crackled in the pit, and I extended my cold hands towards the warmth and comfort of the blaze. My hosts were gracious and offered up their home to the weary traveler. When I gave their door a hearty knock, the elderly Mrs. Gunderson opened the door and welcomed me to the cozy home she shared with her husband Lionel and their sleepy old sheepdog Oscar, who couldn't be bothered from his nap to announce the stranger. She gave me a good, strong cup of coffee that tasted like burned mud and guided me to a comfortable wing-back chair at the hearth.
You could have frozen to death out there. What are you doing wandering around in this horrendous and rather unseasonal weather, my dear, dear boy?
I had my excuse for the late and risky visit ready. I'm just looking for my dog, ma'am, I began, knowing as a dog person she'd understand. I glanced over at old grey Oscar and Lionel Gunderson, both fast asleep and looking very comfortable and at ease. I took off my heavy pack and set it beside me to my right side. Mrs. Gunderson pulled a straight-back wooden chair from the kitchen table and dragged the chair over to where Mr. Gunderson slept. I'd suddenly realized she'd given up her chair for me and offered the comfortable spot back to her. She insisted I stay warm by the fire and assured me it was her pleasure to keep her unexpected guest comfortable. She patted Oscar's fuzzy head and said,
I imagine you must be very worried about your lost pup. Poor thing, lost in this cold, freezing weather.
She'd been so kind. I hated to stand on false pretenses. I'm sorry, ma'am, I answered. I don't actually have a dog. No, I'm here for something else. I sat back in her comfortable chair and saw her grandma-like expression of concern circled by a halo of silver hair. The engagement of her eyes at my response was one of an active listener. I took a breath and began. I have a bit of an, I guess you'd call it an addiction, need. See, I don't usually explain it to my subjects, but you've been such a kind host. I feel you've earned an explanation. Do you read the paper? Follow the news these days?
Oh, kiddo, we don't get the news or the papers way out here. We come up with our own entertainment,
She calmly said. I took another breath. There's some talk about a serial killer, although I don't like that word. I prefer a friend maker. A middle-aged man with brown hair, pale skin, blue eyes. About my build, heck, about my looks, about my personality. To make a long story short, he finds trusting souls to make friends with. The process is quite extraordinary. He gets his new friends all settled in with improved bodies that don't decay and get old. Embalming. It works wonders. To help his friends get more comfortable and relaxed for the process, he takes a sharp razor wire and wraps it thrice around the neck. He slides it back and forth until the blood begins to pool around the neck. Don't worry, he cleans up after himself. He's quite tidy. A little red necklace is a small price to pay for eternal friendship. Now he, of course, realizes that naysayers consider this sort of thing rather rude, to say the least. Negative Nellies say he's a murderer. killer of the elderly, brutal. But I say they don't understand the art of friendship. This brings us to why I'm here. You're such a gentle soul. I thought you deserved an explanation. You see, I'm the guy they call the Red Necklace. I don't much care for that moniker. It doesn't suit me. No, I would have preferred the best friend. Yes, that's much nicer, don't you think? I took a deep breath, tightened my eyelids a moment, then took a long look at my new friend. She didn't seem shocked and lost in misunderstanding as my other friends had been. I fibbed when I told her I didn't usually explain because, truth be told, the explanation was my favorite part. She had a rather sweet smile on her wrinkled, wizened face.
What a dear, dear boy. So young. So very young.
She responded.
You and I seem to have the same little hobby.
She stirred her coffee gently and tapped the spoon on the porcelain side of the cup with a sensitive hand. She gazed towards Mr. Gunderson.
Did you hear that, Lionel, dear? He's a friend. We should properly introduce you two. You really should get to know each other. Wake up, Lionel. There, now that's a good boy.
It was at this moment that I really saw Lionel and Oscar, the old sheepdog. They weren't alive, so to speak. You see, I gave the same romantic little speech about making friends with my work, but for all my talk, I never really believed my friends were alive after I was done with them. Putting a nicer spin on it made my addiction to ending their lives a little sweeter going down. Truth be told, at that moment, looking at Oscar and Lionel Gunderson, seeing the stiff taxidermy work that had left them frozen in time, I felt afraid. I knew she meant it. She meant to make a friend of me. I'd made a red necklace out of 42 people, all strangers and all living in remote parts of the country, across national borders. I'd gained a reputation, but the police had no leads, no witnesses, no trace of me. Only the same method, and only rural areas. I was genuinely afraid now. Well, I'd been talking to her about making friends. I'd already pulled the razor wire from my pack, slipped on my heavy-duty steel-resistant gloves, unraveled the spool of sharp wire, carefully twisted the ends of the razor wire around my thick, heavy-duty gloves at my index finger and pinky fingers. Talking to the friends before ending them made it easier to prepare, as they were distracted by my soothing voice. I looked down from her warm, now terrifying smile, to the glistening wire now frozen in my hands, catching the reflection of the fire in an angry orange hue. My God, I was going to die tonight.
Now,
She said.
It's my turn to tell you a little bedtime story of my own. You've already decided I'm insane, haven't you, dear boy? Oh, you see, that's where the police go wrong every time. Reducing murder to blame on the insane. No, I know my dear Oscar is dead. My Lionel is dead. And a lady gets bored without her dog. Oscar was my whole life. I doted on him like the child I never had. Oscar was very much my furry child, but Oscar liked to wander. He wandered over to a neighboring farm, Mr. Stevens, rather grumpy, a dog-hating corn farmer. Oscar took an ill-fated exploration of his cornfield. He didn't really hurt his crops, but our dear Mr. Stevens decided that was a punishable offense and took it upon himself to be judge and jury for my dear sweet Oscar. Can you imagine? Oh, how are you feeling, dear? A little lightheaded?
I felt dizzy and began to develop a mental numbness like my body had been pumped full of Novocaine. She smiled sweetly and continued her story.
Something had to be done. My dear, lazy, sleeping husband wasn't about to get justice for our dear departed Oscar. The farmer was so confident in his property rights that he had brought me the body of my dear Oscar unashamedly and told me everything with an unsettling apathy. I knew he was right that the authorities wouldn't do much for my dear lost boy, so I devised a little country justice. Before Mr. Gunderson and I married, I often terrified my mother with my skills in taxidermy. I won't say I wasn't cruel to the animals I practiced my skill upon. No. I couldn't help but smile at the writhing and fight against my human strength as they struggled against my fingers, pressed against their little throats. Watching the last breath leave them had filled me with a dark bliss. I enjoyed my work, but Mama, being an animal lover, taught me, once she no longer feared me, that animals don't deserve our cruel indulgence. She didn't say humans did not deserve my handiwork. I had a way of creating a scene with my stuffed animals, a way of creating from death something more to my liking. So I decided if I ever met someone who needed my work to become more friendly-like, I'd take that skill to a new level. Mr. Stevens was my first. Oh, I had fun with him. I gave him a sedative, some of the best coffee I ever brewed over my open fire. He sat right there in my chair where you're sitting now. He drank the coffee and, oh, dear boy, are you starting to feel numb, like you can't move? Probably can't shake your head or speak at this point. Try to blink once for yes and twice for no. Are you feeling the caffeine yet?
She giggled softly at this and continued her story.
As I was saying, Mr. Stevens sat right there, and Mr. Gunderson, where he's sitting now, I'd already stuffed and preserved my dear Oscar. He made Mr. Stevens very uncomfortable, but he sipped my coffee and ate the double-layer caramel cake I'd offer him as a peace offering. He sat and talked and droned on and on about an article in the Farmer's Guide for Seasonal Grain and Vegetable Planting, until suddenly he grew very, very quiet. As quiet as you are now, dear boy. When his body went limp and numb, my Lionel was quite shocked. He didn't support my little hobby. No. He was angry and emotional that I decided to take justice into my own hands. I tried to explain to him as Mr. Stevens' eyes nervously moved back and forth, the only part he could move now, that this wasn't just justice. This was country art. This was what the city folk paid $50 for at the county fair. He didn't appreciate what I'd done. He called me a murderer and told Mr. Stevens he was going to send for the police. Well, I couldn't have that, so I grabbed my old kettle and knocked him over the head 7 times before he could get 2 feet off our front porch. You can probably still see the dent. I tried to pound it out. That was my grandpa's kettle, for goodness sake. I dragged dear Lionel inside and put him back neatly on his old chair, still had his butt print on the cushion. Funny the things we notice when our husbands are dead. I dragged Mr. Stevens, still conscious but unable to move, to my workshop out back. I'm a relatively strong woman. Farm life made me so. I placed Mr. Stevens on a sliding ramp to my work table where I usually worked on my potted plants, transplanting and seeding. His eyes grew wide as I began the work of a skilled taxidermist on the living. What a project! First, I took my small garden shovel and carefully dug out his eyes. He would need glass ones to avoid the gray dulling that comes with dead eyes. His left eye, as I dug out with a giggle of excitement, his right was a well of terror, or perhaps in awe of my handiwork. I pulled the eye from the socket carefully, trailing behind the optic nerve like the frills of a jellyfish underwater. Actually, quite beautiful. I took out the left eye next with the same precision. To the best of my knowledge, he was still awake at this point. Once the first cut was made to remove his vital organs, he died of shock. After doing my work, I stood back and admired the skill I'd put into my most extensive project yet. I returned to my husband and to Oscar after placing the new, improved Mr. Stevens back in his home at his own favorite chair, where I would visit and bring fresh flowers every week. He had no family, you see. I would, of course, need to do the same for my husband. I'd work on him after a much-needed nap. Look how brilliant my work was. You wouldn't even know if I hadn't told you. The fireplace gives the illusion of breath. I've noticed if I look at my Oscar just the right way in the firelight, he looks like he's still breathing. My Lionel and Mr. Stevens have become my closest friends. I've made new friends along the way, just like you. The census people made lovely decorations for my workshop. You'll see them yourself in a moment. How is your coffee, my dear, dear boy? All warmed up now, are we?
She smiled at me again, that sweet, gentle grandma smile. I couldn't move, and knew in the next few minutes I'd experience her handiwork myself. No more red necklaces for me, I suppose. I waited, motionless in her soft chair, while she calmly finished her coffee, relaxed, warm, all settled in.
Kayla? Haley called through the door as she tip-tapped her cane in front of her, trying to locate a way inside. Kayla, if you're here, please answer me. Haley slowed to a stop as she tried to gain her surroundings. She'd only been to Kayla's house a handful of times, not enough to know the layout by heart. Haley began to rub her eyes in frustration. She'd been blind since birth, but sometimes rubbing her useless eyes made her think more clearly. In the silence, she found a feeling in her stomach that something was off, but she couldn't quite place it. Her best friend practically stayed cooped up in her apartment with a book whenever she wasn't at work. And that's why Haley was here, because Kayla hadn't shown up to work in not 1, but 4 days. 1 day no-show was normal. 2 days, foreseeable, but 4? Haley thought as she slowly inched her way down the hallway leading to Kayla's room. As she grew closer, the familiar, sweet vanilla scent that usually drove Haley's nose into overdrive diminished to something darker, something metallic. She almost slammed right into the closed bedroom door, distracted by the pit of nerves that was beginning to grow. Kayla, I'm gonna call your mom. You're starting to scare me. Haley knew for a fact that Kayla had done everything in her power to get away from her mother's controlling grasp, so to have her show up like this would make her mad. Or at the very least, the threat would make her come out of hiding. Still, there was no reply as Haley swung the door open and was met with the moist smell of metal and what Haley deduced to be sweat or day-old chicken. Okay, Kayla, this isn't funny. Haley gasped, suddenly missing the smell of vanilla for once. She drove her hands along the wall as she inched her way further into the room, sensing that she was not alone in the tiny apartment. The sound of sirens in the distance broke the deafening silence as Haley inched her way forward. Her knee slammed into Kayla's hard, unforgiving bed frame. Haley cursed under her breath, suddenly remembering the bed Kayla had bragged about for days after she bought it, due to the bed being big and expensive. Haley lowered her hand down to feel the bed's soft comforter. She ran her hand along the edge of the bed, and a cold hand met hers. "Oh my God!" Haley shrieked, yanking her hand away, trying to make sense of what or who it could be. She debated on whether she should investigate more or call the police. Thinking it over, she assumed whatever it was she had just touched couldn't be anything worth bothering the police about. What if I call the police and this is all some big misunderstanding? Maybe Kayla's in the process of redecorating, painting the room, and maybe she left some wet paper towels on her bed? Haley's hand hovered over the bed as she tried to decide what to do. Lowering her hand again, a thought crossed her mind. What if I don't call the police and there actually is something wrong here? Oh God, what if I call them and there is like a dead body in here or something? They're gonna think I did it. Oh God. She went back and forth for what seemed like forever and came to the conclusion that knowing more about the situation would be her best bet. She hesitantly lowered her hand back down to the bed. This time, she moved her hand toward the middle of the bed, trying to figure out how big the object was, if there was one. Her hand stopped once it reached a sticky substance covering something hard and cold to the touch. Lifting her hand, she brought it to her nose, realizing that whatever it was covered in blood. Haley took in the air and cautiously stepped backwards. She began to panic as thoughts raced through her mind. She began feeling faint and hastily to locate the same doorway she entered, but was met face to face with the wall, the force knocking her to the ground. Throwing her hands out behind her, she prepared herself for impact. What greeted her when she landed was a lot wetter than she had imagined. Her hands trembled against what was supposed to be carpet, only now it seemed to be covered in a semi-wet and clumpy substance. Oh God, she thought. Blood? More of it. What the hell is going on here? She struggled to her feet, shaking. She decided right then and there that she needed to know what lay in her friend's bed. She again found the edge of the bed and slowly made her way towards the head of the bed, where her hand came into contact with something that appeared to be hair. Grasping the hair, she inched her hands forward, determined to find the roots and whatever may be attached. God, she thought. Whatever this is, whoever this is. Fuck, this is really long hair. She stopped. Long hair. Her mind flashed to those many times she had ran her fingers through Kayla's long, soft hair. Kayla and Haley had spent hours braiding and brushing that hair. More determined than ever, Haley resumed moving her hands along the hair until she found a head. Her right hand trickled from the forehead down the pointed nose. Haley began to cry as she hastily found the neck to look for a pulse, only to find her fingers in a wide hole that seemed to feel like the shape of a river made of flesh and dried blood. The next sound that came out of Haley's throat can only be described as grief and fear mixed into one. She lifted her fingers from the throat of her friend and made their way back to the face. Gently, she rested her hands on her friend's cheeks. They were cold. Haley knew there was no help in the world that could rescue her friend from the clutches of death. Holding the head of her beloved friend in her hands as she allowed herself a single moment to grieve, she again pondered what to do next. Who to call? The sirens that were once in the distance were closer now. Much closer. Is that help? Or for some other matter? Should I try to flag them down? You're right, a blind person flagging down a siren she cannot see. That would go over well. A sudden, rapid bang jolted her from her thoughts. Police! We're looking for Kayla Wilkins! Bang, bang, bang! Open up! Haley froze. There was no time to plan, let alone inhale, before a final bang and the sound of a door shattering like glass pelted the air. Haley's heart raced as footsteps grew closer, her hands still held tight to her friend. Her cold skin in Haley's warm hands brought some comfort, knowing she wasn't alone. Freeze! Hands in the air where I can see them!
Chilling tales for dark nights.